The repository pattern usually looks clean at first, but in long-lived code bases, it's often where complexity starts to pile up. Today, we are breaking down repository pattern mistakes nobody talks about. Repositories become God classes. The repository slowly starts doing everything. Here, the repository fetches data from the network, then it writes to the database, it updates the cache, and on top of that, it runs business logic like apply, discount a premium. All of this lives inside a single class. That means data access, coordination, and business rules are all mixed together. Here is the healthier version. The repository itself does almost nothing. It asks the local data source for data. If that's missing, it asks the remote data source. Database logic lives in the local data source, and the network logic lives in the remote data source. The repository coordinates, but it doesn't do the work. Data source details leak out. When callers decide where data comes from, abstraction is fake. Here, the caller checks a flag. If from cache is true, it calls the database. Otherwise, it calls the API directly. That means the UI knows about databases and networks. The moment the caller makes decision, the repository is no longer an abstraction. It becomes a thin wrapper. Here is the fix. The view model simply calls load user. That call delegates to the repository and stops caring where the data comes from. Cache, database, network, those are repository concerns. Callers should ask for data, not negotiate storage strategy. One repository per screen. This sounds reasonable, especially in UI-driven apps. Here, repositories are created per screen. A home repository, a profile repository, a settings repository. Those names already reveal the problem. These repositories mirror screens, not concepts. That's how the same user data ends up duplicated. One screen updates the username, another formats it differently. Over time, things drift. Here is the better approach. Repositories are named after domain concepts, users, accounts, feature flags. When repository represents the domain, multiple screens can safely reuse the same logic. Repositories should represent the domain, not the UI. Returning framework types. Most teams don't even notice this one. The repository returns live data. It exposes user entity directly. Both come from Android framework. That means Android types are now part of your domain. Once this happens, everything that depends on the repository is forced to understand Android. Here is the fix. The repository returns plain domain modules, which is list of users. No framework types. Android stays at the edge. The domain stays clean, portable, and testable. CRUD-Only Repositories. This mistake usually shows up right after repositories are added. The repository exposes, insert, update, and delete methods. These methods tell me how data is stored, but nothing about why it changed. CRUD is storage thinking, not business thinking. When repositories expose only CRUD, business decisions drift upward into view models, services, or even UI code. Here is the alternative. Methods like activate user and deactivate users express intent. You immediately know what the system is doing, not just which table changed. Now the repository protects the meaning, just not the persistence. Fake abstraction. This one looks good architecture, but it isn't. Here we have an interface and exactly one implementation, and it stays that way for years. There is no real abstraction here, just an extra layer to jump through. It adds indirection but no flexibility. Here is when abstraction actually makes sense. Now we have two real behaviors. One implementation reads from local storage, another talks to network. If there is no variation, you don't need the interface yet. Add abstraction when the difference is real, not just planned. Business rules hidden in repositories. This is easy to miss during reviews. The check looks harmless, but user.isPremium is a business rule, and it's buried inside repository code. When rules live here, they are hard to find and easy to forget. No one knows where decisions are actually made. Here is the fix. Activating a premium user becomes a use case. You can find it, test it, or even change it, all without touching the data access code. Repositories should enforce consistency, saving and loading correctly. Business rules belong where decisions are visible, like use cases. Cache without strategy. This line looks clean. First, try the cache. If it's empty, call the API. And for a while, it works. But there is no strategy here. No idea how old the data is. No rule for when it should be refreshed. Eventually, the cache becomes fast and wrong. Here's the healthier version. The cache checks freshness explicitly. If the data is stale, we fetch from the API and write the results back. Caching must be intentional. If you don't define the rules, the cache will betray you later. Performance is hidden. This one causes performance issues without anyone noticing. The method name looks harmless, but it hides a lot. But it might return data from memory or it might hit the network. When callers can't see the cost, they call it freely. That's how slow screens and repeated network calls appear. Here is the fix. Cheap operations are named clearly, expensive operations are named loudly. For example, get cached user clearly tells you it's cheap. Refresh user clearly tells you this one does the real work. Method names should reveal the cost. If a call is expensive, the name should warn you. Repository as architecture banded. This one isn't about the code, it's about the mindset. Here, the repository becomes a shortcut. Everything flows into it. UI logic, business logic, data logic. The hope is that repository will organize the mess. But the repository don't fix broken boundaries. They only hide them. Here is what a healthy structure looks like. The UI triggers a use case. The use case owns the business flow. The repository handles the data access. Data sources deal with storage and network. Each layer has a clear job. If the boundaries are clear, adding patterns won't save the system. Fix the responsibilities first, then use patterns to make them stronger. Across all these examples, the repository pattern isn't the real problem. Problems start when responsibilities blur and boundaries aren't defined. At that point, repositories take on work they never meant to do. Complexity doesn't disappear, it just moves around. When that happens, the repository isn't the problem, it's where the problems show up. Follow for more real-world, untold tech insights. Thank you.